Well, I mean, I think one should start by, well, is my government borrowing too much? I think the answer to that question depends on who is your government. I think that when we ask, there are over 50 countries on the continent. We have about 7 countries that are in are already in debt distress, which means that they cannot pay their debt service. Of those countries, of the 7 countries, we have about 4 of them that are actually fragile, or countries that are in conflict or coming out of conflict, like Sudan, South Sudan, of course, Eritrea, which is a question of arrears. Then we have 12 to 15 countries in what we call the high debt distress category, where their debt on the continent, we measure sort of high debt distress as when you have 60% of your debt to GDP. So if you go over the 60% mark, then yes, you are getting into the high debt distress category. But I think that we need to be maybe a little bit more discerning of the question. Because when we ask, I think that the question should not be, is my government borrowing too much? But is my government spending the resources that it gets on the right things? So borrowing is not, as we all know, and I always repeat, borrowing is not bad. And I think borrowing is important because we need those resources to be able to, invest in the next energy plant, invest in the next road, invest in education, and invest in health. The question is whether when we get those resources, we're spending them appropriately. Because it's only if you spend it appropriately that then you can get the resources that when you invest, you get a return on your investment. And it's with that return on your investment that you pay off your debt, right? So if you borrow money and you don't invest it well, then you don't have anything to pay back the debt. And that's where the problem starts. So I think that we're maybe on the continent a little bit too focused on, is my government borrowing too much? We should be asking, what is my government spending the resources on? And are those investments the right investments? And I think we don't spend enough time asking that other part of the question. And we are almost sort of beholden to this, are we in a debt crisis? But I think that when you look at some countries that have been able to borrow, they have been able to use those resources to provide more energy. More energy has been able to then crowd in more investment. More investment has then resulted in higher tax revenues, and so we can build more schools. So essentially, if you borrow to do these things, then you borrow, you create, and you build, you invest in an energy plant. With an energy plant, energy consumption is more stable, investment comes in, you create jobs, you have businesses that can now pay you taxes, and out of those taxes, you can pay your debt. That is good investment. That is good borrowing. If you borrow the resources and you don't do any of these things, and you spend it on what we call recurrent expenditure, which is maybe essentially paying salaries or doing things that do not provide you with a return on your investment, then you get into a debt service problem. And so I think we on the continent really need to change the question to start saying, who is investing efficiently? First of all, probably to ask the question, do we know how much our governments are borrowing? Do we know from whom? So it's a question also of transparency. We shouldn't just wake up one morning and say, oh, my country is in debt distress. When did they borrow the resources and what did they use it for? I think those 2 questions we as Africans or any other country that is borrowing resources needs to ask first before we get into, is there a looming debt crisis and what can we do with that?